So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
And the first item on the agenda is Mr. Carter from Carter and Associates to take us through 5-year projection information.
Thank you, Mayor. Glad to be here today. It's a beautiful, cool day in North Topsail Beach. And you look at that and you wonder why people live here, right? When I went online to look at North Topsail Beach pictures, there were hundreds of them, and it made you want to live here. So, okay, who has the controller?
Ricky in the back.
Hey, Ricky. Okay, you can go to next slide, please. It's frozen. It's a cool morning. Mm.
Ricky, did you break it?
Mayor and members of council, thank you for the opportunity to come and talk about this subject. I just listed a few things that I hope we get to on this. First, how the forecast works, or how they generally work. What are you forecasting? General fund, capital investments, and then others. We'll talk about beach. We'll talk about fully vetting capital needs. We'll talk about council's expectations when we present this later in the budget year, and a few topics like that. Next, please. So what I'm hoping we get out of this today, now I had your sign here and Alice hates it, so she made me take it out.
Budgeting for a new sign.
I saw that when I looked at the council from yesterday, and I saw that we're getting a new sign. I thought it was kind of quaint, actually, but anyway. That's
So did I.
still a lovely picture.
You've only been here for 6 months, shut up.
So hope for our outcomes today is to set the process for the forecast development, because we're working in the town to do that. Initial expectations, what do we want it to produce, especially how will it go forward, obtain your input and expectations, redesign the process as needed, because I know we started it last year, and then we'll talk about a future meeting date, although I have that now. I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about backgrounds on this, and about multi-year CIP and operating fund forecasts, just to sort of give you a snapshot of what I've seen developing over time. For those of you on the council who know me, you know that I worked for government many, many years ago, and I was the CFO of the city of Charlotte. I'm not going to tell you how many years ago, but a lot. And it was at that time that the city was heavily engaged in forecasting, both for capital as well as operating, but more on the CIP side. So North Carolina local government set the standard. We've talked about that several times before, particularly on the capital side. Last year, you saw a forecast of your CIP and a first operating forecast for the last year. And then I would just say to you, from my point of view, if you make sound capital investments, that contributes to an overall lower cost of services. And that's why it's so important to look at the capital side, and then ultimately to think about your operating budget and its adequacy. When you all requested an operating forecast, I'll just say to you, that isn't often done by small jurisdictions. And having that discussed, I think, says a lot about how y'all are thinking and how you're looking towards future times. Some of the larger cities and counties do operating forecast, generally 3 to 5 years. They typically tend to be pretty macro rather than micro. And we'll talk about that a little bit later too. And then finally, I would say to you, if you properly do an operating forecast, it includes a number of parties and steps. It's kind of like developing a CIP. It requires input, and it requires input really at the department level and then above. So it's not sort of simply taking it and saying, well, what happens if we have a 3% increase? What happens? It's more about what do people inside the actual organization see in terms of cost. And that's why, and I probably talked about this a little bit later too, I see this as a development process that will take more than 1 year to complete, and it will involve you in looking at what the process ought to be and what it ought to produce. And then management will come back to you and say, well, this is what it will take for us to get this done, and to receive the input from departments and others, maybe engineers on the capital side, to get this done. For operating forecast, what I have typically seen and what you typically see in others, I mentioned private sector at the bottom. We'll talk about that just a little bit as well. Generally, a lot of people use a 5-year standard. 3 years is more likely accurate. I think the key for any kind of forecast, especially on the operating side, it has to be done frequently or it becomes not relevant. The numbers just aren't right or accurate, maybe they're stale. And particularly in the environment we're in now with respect to inflationary trends, will those inflationary trends stay? You know, for the last 2 days, I've been heavily engaged in talking to a number of people in financial markets that I trust. And who would have thought that the failure of 2 banks would have generated all of the discussion that it's generated around have we made proper moves on interest rate increases on the short end? Did the Fed go too fast? Have we created a circumstance where liquidity inside banks, where personal liquidity for some people has been so impacted by interest rate increases that it's leading to unintended consequences? I certainly hope they weren't intended. Give you the example, the bank in California had lost so much, its only ability to find liquidity. You know, guys, the perfect thing for a bank is you take deposits, you pay a low interest cost, and then you loan them at a higher interest cost, and you earn the spread between what you loaned it for and what you're paying for the cash that people are giving you. Well, unfortunately, their lending did not keep up with their deposits, and so they bought lots of federal securities, treasuries. And we all know the rule. If you buy it at one rate and the interest rate falls, the value of your bond goes up. If the interest rates rise, the value of your bonds drop precipitously. So all of a sudden, if you thought you had $1 billion worth of bonds, now maybe those bonds are worth $700 million. And so the bottom line is when there was the fight for liquidity, all of a sudden you couldn't produce liquidity out of selling your investments at a proper level. So those are some of the kind of unintended consequences that come out of this. Likewise, and I'll just say this for all of us who are students of the federal budget, the increase in interest rates for the federal deficit has increased the interest cost to the federal government, such that if rates continue to rise and stay high, we could actually say interest on the federal debt approach what we're spending on the military or some such thing as that. So there's going to be very large pressure to subdue interest rate increases just because of the effects that it's obviously had. Now we'll say where all that takes us. I heard one economist yesterday. I have no life. I watch and read economic stuff at night. This is why my wife doesn't like me a whole lot. I mean, yes, it is somewhat fiction. But the whole issue of where will we be in coming years, and I know we're going to talk about that in a little bit, is a big question mark. But we have to be in a somewhat different place than we are now so that we can get a little bit of certainty so people can more easily make decisions.
Before you leave that, just a couple of quick questions
Yes,
because of
sir.
liquidity issue, and I'm sure you're going to address it. You know, we're looking at within our company as well is, one of the things that's going on right now is blowing past the 250 insured number.
Yes.
Okay, we've got money sitting in different banks. I'm assuming you could give us, I mean, obviously trying to put $10 million at 250 levels in different banks doesn't work mathematically, and that's the problem. Some of the depositors out there I saw were, you know, you're talking about liquidity, they borrowed, I can't remember, they had $160 billion worth of deposits, and only 15% they could loan out.
Yeah.
And so basically they had, and then when the interest rates flipped, was it inversion, in the long and short term, they were screwed. But
Right.
would you give us some advice on, you don't have to today, because I'm
Right,
catching a cold, but
Right.
I believe most of our money sits in one bank, and, you know, with some of the issues relating to access to capital, if you could give us some thoughts on that, that would help too.
I would be happy to. Here's my just initial thought, and we can look at that, Alice, at some point. As you know, that they secure what's in a depository account to you. And so, you know, my hope is we don't have a lot of excess money laying around in a depository account. We can make investments through the North Carolina Cash Management Trust and others. And of course, they are somewhat collateralized by their investments, but they're also collateralized by their investments. So I think the point is where we need to be is under North Carolina investment law, you can't do too many bad things because it doesn't allow you. Like you can't take money that y'all have that you're planning to make payroll on in 3 months and buy 20-year treasuries in hopes that interest rates will drop and you'll make a ton of money. That's just illegal. So if you do it, you've broken the law. So we have investment laws that help us some, but I think what our challenge would be and what all would be, at least at the point we're in now, is to make sure we diversify, make sure we put our money in places that are adequately diversified inside the investment portfolio, or not all bonds, or not all stocks, or not all this, or not all that.
I got us off skip
Right.
but I just think you brought up the banking issue, I think it's something.
Right, and I think that's something we can look into.
I wrote it down as a problem.
Yeah. So anyway, so 5 years, a lot of people, well, for those who look at them. Others sometimes tend to look at 3 years. They tend to be reviewed every year so that we can correct what might have changed in the last year. The real question is, are we going, right now we had the general fund looked at last year. I think the real question will be, what about the beach fund? How do we, because, yeah,
Write that down, Mike. So that was yesterday's.
because that's where revenues have done well because of people using the beach and coming here. We have some cost inside the beach fund that will be falling away in future years as we pay off that USDA debt and others. And so I think ultimately, looking at the beach fund and how it gets invested into the future, do we accumulate money for a project later? Do we look more at projects now? But I think in order to really get there, we really have to know what the beach plan is. What is next? How big is it? What does it cost? Can it be done in phases, or does it have to all be done at one time? What are the methodologies to do it? Are there more grant monies available? I see the state of North Carolina has a $3 billion surplus, so maybe there's some more beach money available, one would hope. Although I will say that when we see we have that much, everybody wants a little help, so who knows? So anyway, the other thing inside the beach fund, and I don't know, Alice, y'all may already be there. I didn't have time to talk to Caitlin about it because I know she's been busy on the budget. But I think inside the beach fund in particular, in addition to looking at what are the needs for new nourishment or first-time nourishment, we have to make sure that we set aside the money for the recurring maintenances. Because, guys, it's horrible to say, and y'all will probably run me out of the room when I say it. I guess The only upside on an engineered beach, when you have a storm, it gets brought back. And so there have been a number of storms, and for a number of beaches on this coastline, we kind of got helped on the maintenance because of that. But we can't count on that.
And I will tell you, we talked about this a lot yesterday, and we do currently have it slotted in the budget for our engineer to assist the Beach and Inlet Advisory Committee on a long-term beach plan. So for
Perfect.
this upcoming budget year, our focus as a board is to finish the existing projects, because as you know, they're still ongoing.
Right.
But we will be planning for what is next,
Right.
and that fits right into what you're discussing.
Perfect.
And the engineered beach thing, Mayor, that you talked about, that's part of the goals, is to have that, because we believe 4 and 5 will be engineered beaches at the end of these 2 projects.
Perfect.
But we'll take that offline. I have a question about that, because there's not in federal flood, so.
Yeah,
5 was built as an engineered beach when it was built in 2015.
My question, but 2, 3, and 4, Tom, what I was thinking is if they're still in Cobra Zone and not in federal flood, I don't know that we qualify for FEMA to assist us in putting those back after a storm.
Not to get off subject, and we probably should table it. That's what Chris is looking at right
Yeah.
now, and his belief is there is money available in the Cobra zones, depending on how you go after it, and that could be part of the beach plan and stuff. And because we had a disagreement, Fran was talking about how you can't use certain money in Cobra zones, and Chris says that's not true. So that's part of what's gonna be in there.
The answer is, the real answer from the history lesson is, it depends. We've had sand put on Cobra beaches after named storms as a result of federal assistance and state assistance.
But I think we can bring, that should be something we have,
right, yeah.
No guarantee.
Yeah, the real key is, particularly for your engineered beaches, if you don't maintain them, you lose your engineered status, and then you lose your storm reimbursement. But if they're not engineered, they still have to be renourished or maintained. And so to me, especially as you get into the beach plan, because I know in speaking with the town manager, she had told me that was a process that was ongoing. It seems to me what happens inside the beach fund is renourishment is your first priority. It has to be. And we would need to look at how do we build reserves for that, and how those reserves are invested and held until the time they come. And then that will leave what is left for new projects. And I just think that's going to be a really interesting study, because as you know, when we get out of the USDA, we shortened that. That was one of the best decisions this council has made, because it was a very low interest rate environment. It took away that long amortization. The LGC likes us better. So that was a great plan, and when it pays down, then that's going to bring a goodly amount of money to the table. Probably part of the money that you can reinvest for maintenance, future maintenance money. But at the right time, that would be looked at, and I would think that you would want to see, maybe on the beach, you look further than 5 years. Because often, on the other beach towns that we're advisor to, we found a number of them that thought that they were going to look at a 5 or 6 year renourishment. They were a little longer. We just did Nag's Head, and it was nearly 8 years. So depending upon how good a job was done initially, what is the storm situation, what do you do to keep them maintained, that sort of thing, they can go longer. One final thing that I'll say to you that's important is North Carolina cities in particular, counties lately have done a way better job at this, is separating operating and capital. Unfortunately, what happens if you only have one fund, the general fund, and you're trying to allocate between capital and operating, what always happens? The operating takes it in the neck, is the last thing funded. And so y'all have done a good job thus far in doing some separating, looking at your CIP and so forth. Private sector models, the private sector has done a lot in forecasting. Unfortunately, oftentimes those forecasts have probably been a tinge aggressive. But, it just depends on who the audience is. I think for a governmental entity, what our goal ought to be if we continue to do this, especially the operating planning, is we look at what we looked at and then we look at what happened. And then we will know whether or not our plans were pretty accurate or not. And it's easy to look at the old plan and compare it to what comes out of the audit and say, here's what happened.
And you'll give us guidance in terms of structure, whether, debt and equity, how you do it, because financing has changed a lot, to your point. But if you come back and say you need $30 million, okay, our forecast says you can borrow, you got 15 in the bank and 15 you can borrow, and this is what it's cost, right? So you'll give us that kind of help as well?
Right. Yes. Yes. Okay, next slide, please. Well, as you know, capital planning is a number of elements. Y'all have looked at these. There is a larger and larger emphasis on PAYGO, setting aside money so that you can fund PAYGO and that you don't have to borrow everything. There are a number of towns and cities that try to peg this by a percentage. Is it 50-50? Is it 60-40? Is it 70-30? For a lot of high growth entities, it's almost impossible not to borrow it simply because of the growth and how quick it takes. We obviously know where we go for state, federal, and other grant sources. I think the 10 million, I think it's an odd number, but I use 10 as my memory number, was a great number to have gotten, and it's going to have a great deal of positive impact. And then obviously we'll look at debt together with the PAYGO and the grants. And then ultimately, depending on what you're working on, I have seen more and more private sources come into the mix. Foundations, local citizenry, especially if you deal with facilities that are heavily visitor-oriented. I'll give you an example. It's not you guys, but I'll give you an example of what I'll talk about. We were advisor to the city of Greensboro on their nearly $100 million performing arts facility. It is a gorgeous, gorgeous facility for those of you who have not seen it. And they raised half of that money privately. And so I just think probably on virtually everything, the question is could we get some private money? Doesn't hurt. And then I think you've got to separately plan for maintenance as well as new facilities, because in this state as well as many others, a great deal of the capital plans are now consumed by maintenance catch-up from prior years. And so I think as we look at capital planning, we can't just look at new facilities. We have to look at what we have, look at maintenance cycles, see where we are. And a lot of time, PAYGO funds is what is often used for that maintenance as opposed to the new facilities. Okay, next slide, please. Alice, y'all have had this dedicated capital fund for how long? 2 years. So what I often sell to a lot of other people, I don't have to sell to you so much because we talked about it a couple of years ago and you got it done. But I think what is really important, especially as you look at revenues, is oftentimes that capital fund is largely funded by contributions from the general fund and or grants or private fundraising or anything else that you find. And the fact that what would be the best way I could say for this? I think there needs to be some consistency in the movement of money from the general fund to the capital funds. In a number of our clients where we've helped them establish a community investment fund, is we've using what we call a frozen amount out of the general fund. And you freeze an amount and you put it in every year, and then you evaluate at some some year or every other year process, depending on how often your CIP is developed. Some people do CIPs every other year rather than every year. Then you evaluate how efficient your contributions are and are you meeting the need out of what you're sending. And then, as we know, you have to account for them in a separate fund, and that's what you're doing now. You know how the CIF works because you have one, and so I'm not going to spend as much time on that, other than I think it has to constantly be looked at to determine if it's being adequately funded. And I think that's the real question mark. That would be looked at in terms of how we look at the forecast, because we're going to need to look at debt service, all those expenses in the CIF and outside the operating fund, and then look at where are we sending money from what place and at what time, and how are we sending the money in to pay for that.
Can I just ask you a quick question?
Surely.
And again, it's just, looking on the private side, not on the public side. In our capital fund, what we've tend to look at, when Mike and I talked about this, Mike, 2 years ago, it was basically to set aside money for the firehouse and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
What we have not included in a capital fund are things like police cars, things like that, which to me, in the private sector, are all capital expenditures that work that way. Should we segregate, the way that we're doing it now is we keep what I consider capital stuff is not all encompassing that we're using. So that'd be something to give us some advice on as well, as to what goes in that pot.
But I believe the fire trucks are in the capital.
No, I'm using like police
Yeah.
cars and stuff.
No,
like
I
that,
understand what you're saying. I think it's a mix, and maybe it's a dollar volume or something that but I think we're talking a lot about, the beach fund, which we do need to take a look at. I have concerns too about making sure that we're continuing to look at our capital improvements and our capital projects, because we have a lot of them. And so we need to make sure that we're planning for them. We have a few that we talked about yesterday that are not yet in our plan.
Okay.
And it's catch-up, to the mayor's point.
Yeah.
We're going to have those in the one that's upcoming.
Yes, and the main items that we're talking about are the fire truck, the fire station build, new fire station 2, which right now is estimated at $6.5 million.
Saw that.
That's getting ready to go out for bid at the end of this month, so we'll know within 30 days what the bids are coming in at, but right now we're looking at $6.5 million. And one of the important things that the board will need to look at is the 3 pennies that are allocated from the county. We did a memorandum of agreement with the county this past fiscal year that'll take effect this July, where they're allocating 3 pennies to North Topsail Beach for fire needs. So we'll want to see how that's mapped out as far as what we can expect to bring in, and have that all laid out to help us to determine how much we're going to have to borrow.
Whether you need a separate fire fund.
And then we talked briefly about, and we haven't
Potential.
made a decision as a board yet, but investing in a bike lane. We've also talked about, further out would be expansion of the police department, and also, an off-site EOC. So we've got some definite items that Alice had mentioned that are coming, we need to do. And then we've got some things as a board that we would like to look at investing in, but I don't know where they would fall.
And we do have initial numbers for those, just estimates, that were plugged in last year when we went over CIP at a high level at that point. So we do have those estimates,
Okay.
because those are priorities. The EOC, fire station, of course, and then the plan of the fire truck replacements
So
In the
okay.
bike lane.
and the bike lane.
Yeah.
Well, you're gonna talk about that later.
Yeah, I want to go back to the fire station. You're taking bids next month,
We're going to be going out for bid at the end of this month,
at the end of this month.
yes.
And how long will those bids be good for?
Typically, they're good for 60 or 90 days. The architect has not come back with something for us to look at, to review, so we don't have the timeline on that, but typically it's 60 or 90 days for a review process. I would imagine that it would probably be more along the lines of a 90 review for this type of project.
The reason I ask that is if we're going to finance a portion of that or all of that, we're gonna have to start on that pretty quick because it's a
Yes.
90-day process.
Yes, that's the priority this year.
It's a 90-day process. I looked at what was in the operating budget that y'all looked at last year in the forecast, and it assumed a 10-year debt financing. We could think about 15 years because it has a much longer life than 10 years. And the interesting thing is the difference between a 15-year rate and a 10-year rate's not that large because most of the cost is on the front end because the Fed has raised, you know, if you look at the interest curve, it doesn't do that anymore. Well, for y'all, that, it's kind of flat.
Yeah.
So if you borrow short, you pay about the same rate as if you borrow long.
And just so you know, under the plan that the county put together that we supported, they call it a fire tax, but they asked for our support on it. So they're designating 3 cents, 3 pennies. For us, that's a little under $500,000 a year that has to go towards fire stuff. And I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, we also have Onslow County financing the fire truck.
That's through a grant through
USDA.
Jones Onslow.
Jones
Yeah.
Onslow.
It's a zero interest loan.
Right.
I've seen it.
Or Joe MC, I'm sorry.
Joe MC.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how, if you're gonna use 500,000, I think the real issue on the 500,000 is how much of it is gonna go towards operations or new cost, and how much of it you have available to pay the capital. Has
Well-
that been thought about?
Well, the idea would be to put it all towards the capital,
Okay,
because we're covered on the operating side. So we would want to see that mapped out as far as how much it would all be going to the capital. The other part of that is not only the 3 cents from the county that is allocated to fire services for North Topsail, but also, we talked a little bit yesterday, going through the operations and the contingency. We left the contingency number at 0, so we did not balance that out, so that the board can make a decision whether they want to talk about, right now we have 7 pennies allocated to the capital. Do you want to increase the pennies going to the capital? So we'll need to look at scenarios such as that for the board to be able to make an informed decision on what they want to do when we talk about the tax rate.
And we also did not budget any pay raises or anything like that, and we left that,
We didn't do payroll yet.
yeah, that contingency money may be used for some of that.
Well, and also, I assume he,
I don't foresee that.
right,
That,
be it a big issue.
yeah, no.
But I think that, you know, the other thing that we're looking at that would be helpful, and I think that, and I understand this is not standard accounting for towns, is a balance sheet that shows encumbered and unencumbered cash and what that looks like going forward. Because as you instructed us last time, we're not allowed to do lines of credit. So we did the SOBs, we had to borrow it all. So we might be sitting on $5 million in cash, but we have $5 million in an obligation under that SOB. So that's basically restricted cash. And I think you brought this up yesterday about if it looks like we're flushing cash, but we basically have obligations that offset that, that's not free cash, and I think that would be helpful as well.
well, and there are means in your general fund or your beach fund or any other fund that you can restrict the fund balance as a restriction to a specifically dedicated purpose, and that's something we could do as part of the, you would do it by resolution or other process, so we can find ways so that if cash isn't your fund balance.
That's my point.
Your fund balance is your fund balance. Your unassigned fund balance is what you can legally use under North Carolina law. So what we would want to do is say, we know we have cash, but in that fund, if we have $5 million in cash, if the unassigned fund balance is $1 million, that's all you got.
Yeah.
The rest of it's set aside for something else. Okay? All right, cool. Well, let me just say this, Alice, because with the bids coming in like they are, if we look at a 15-year financing, that basically pays that pays the bulk of the debt service,
It does.
especially if we can look at a 15-year financing.
That's 7.5, and you'll be borrowing 6.5, and then interest rates are probably pretty good at 15 still. Right?
Yeah, so I mean, you know, you'll have a little over that, but it's not shouldn't be a whole lot. Well, there'll be a little because we'll have to do a level amortization. So I presume we'll start talking to banks about that? Okay. I'll make some inquiries starting later this week. Okay. You guys got this down. We talked beach fund. I think that's very important in how we look at that. And then I think the capital side, as we talked about earlier, is the other one. How much we move to the CIF, the constant funding, is it adequate, that sort of thing. And then adding new revenues is needed. That's the real question, is what is their needs in new revenues? What are they? And when are they necessary, and what year? Okay. This is just a graphic that sort of shows you for any of your funds, whether you're talking about affordability from an operating fund or a capital fund. In a selected funded basis, you have to find everything that flows in and then allocate for everything that flows out. Debt service if it's a capital fund or capital, or operating cost if it's a capital. And then you have to look at your maintenance and repairs, your technology cost, what you're doing pay-go and what you're not. And then out of all of that comes your new capacity. And I guess the dilemma for some folks is the flow ins are not as big as the flow out needs. And I think that's what we're going to have to determine, is how well funded are we. And it's a pretty simple formula if you do it inside distinct defined funds, which you have. Okay. So guys, here's the hard part on decisions. This is where I really want y'all's thoughts and feedback. You made the decision in the last budget year. You saw an operating forecast. I've looked at it. I saw some of the assumptions within it and that sort of thing. Where do we go from here compared to where you were in the last one? As an example, do we need to do sensitivity analysis? What do you want to see inside that model? Because I'm not entirely sure. I think it's a multi-year process, and I think until we've engaged department heads at a level more and more, the real question becomes, is this year the final one, or will it be the next year one? But the real issue is going to be, how much sensitivity analysis do you want to make inside the forecast?
As I just mentioned, at least in our conversations yesterday, I think that there was a board consensus that we don't want to have to increase taxes this year, because we did that last year to fund the capital improvement fund and looking for the needs of the fire station and other things coming up. But I believe our goals for this year are to complete the projects that you helped us map out last year along with our staff, the ongoing beach projects that we have, and get the fire station up and going. I think we have enough on our plate right now to get through the year and not have anybody with any spare time on their hands. But we do want to be looking at the future, and as Alice had mentioned, some of those other items that we've got in the capital plan,
Okay.
as well as
Okay.
the beach.
Okay. So
Can we?
I don't know if I answered your question.
Can we have that as a discussion item, because there's things that I would like in the model on the sensitivity side. I 100% agree with what she said, but we're looking at forecasts. It's nice not to talk about a rate increase for this year or next year or whatever, but in terms of fiscal responsibility and stewards of the town's money, it'd be helpful, I think, to understand, inflation ideas that you've got, those type of things. And it goes back to, when we're talking about tax rate change or whatever, I think you can start with whatever we've got right now, and you've got a tax base. We also just saw the tax base go up by a few percent because it wasn't a revow, we still had things like that, is to do some kind of forecast to us. What I'm concerned about is, and it's something that he brought up the other day, was it might look like we are flush cash, all right? And people look at that and say, why can't you drop our rates? Why can't you do this? And the answer is because 3 years from now, we're looking at a different fire station, or we've got to have something else like that. And I think unless we have that sensitivity in there, okay, in other words, let's not assume we can borrow everything going forward. Let's assume that we've got interest rates that are different than they are today. And the sensitivity stuff would be in there, and I think that Mike brought this up. We were talking about the groin and the shock that we got in terms of what they thought the cost of that was gonna be. So if we're assuming we've got to do a new fire station in 5 years, you can't assume it's gonna come in at 6.5.
But you also can't, if the groin is 7 to 10 years out, if it even happens.
No, I'm just talking, what I'm talking about is just a forecast that is sensitive to inflation, to interest rate changes.
And I guess my thought on that is I don't even know how long, if you're talking about sensitivity to interest rate changes and just to inflation in general, based on what you're just saying, I don't even know how long that would be valid for.
Right, but if you don't have anything, you've got nothing. What I'm saying is, he may come back to us and say 3 years is a good forecast. What I'm saying is, if we start borrowing money, which we're gonna have to do, I think, for the new fire station, we don't have $6.5 million in cash. That is going to encumber money for a period of time, all right?
Certainly.
And so you take that off, and he takes it off my revenue forecast, you know, and I'm assuming you can go back and look at the last 3 or 4 years even, to get some idea of revenues. And he might come back and say, you've got a surplus this year, but next year, if you get the same amount of revenues, your expenses have gone up, because now you're paying for the fire station, you're doing this kind of stuff. If we don't have that sensitivity in there, we're gonna think that, well, we've got a surplus this year and everything's great. And, you know, and I think that's what the county's doing too. They're looking at the schools they've gotta build and things like that, so.
But, I mean, we do have, I guess what I'm trying to figure out, Rick, is we do have a forecast now that looks out several years that Mr. Carter helped us with last year. So I think all we're doing this year is plugging in, if we have real numbers for the fire station instead of what we thought was a real number last year, or, you know, the best number we could come up with. We're just updating what we already have. I think that's the whole point of this conversation, is we've got modeling tools in place for what we're planning as a town and as a board, and each year they need to get updated with the budget decisions for that year.
I'm not sure that's accurate from what Doug said. I'm not sure we've got a financial forecasting model in place today.
We looked at the general fund last year, I think, mostly,
Yes.
and capital.
Yes, yes. And Caitlin did the operating forecast last year. And we have looked at a lot of, it's in the beach model when we did refundings and that sort of thing. My whole, the capital model, we're going to, in looking at the capital model, it's going to force you in certain cases to borrow certain amounts and other amounts that you're going to have available for PAYGO. Because my guess is you won't have it all for PAYGO. Not many people do. So we can work through that. The real sensitivity analysis that is not of concern, but that we need to focus on is inside the operating budget. At what point are our operating costs going to exceed our operating revenues? And your budget is like, and I'm not taking the beach fund into account, I'm doing the general fund. Your general fund is like every other general fund in America. It's heavily oriented towards personnel cost. Heavily. It's probably 65 or 70%. And so the real key to whether or not we have adequacy in revenues is really thinking through what is our cost of employment going to be? What are we going to have to pay people to retain and keep them? Folks, I had this great, I went to an economics program several months ago, and the interesting thing I learned about that is the number one concern for our country on future cost and how we operate is workforce development. We have an enormous workforce problem, enormous. That is ultimately going to have an impact. I don't know at what level. So I think guidance that we need as we work with Alice and Caitlin and others on this new general fund forecast is is what do we see the cost of employment being for the future, the cost of our employees? And do we do sensitivity analysis on that?
And that's where I was going. I'm looking more at what the expenses, if, in simple terms, if we've got 6% inflation, you can't give people a 2% raise because they just lost 4%. Okay, and when you look at over half our budget being operating, being payroll and things like that, what does that look like 3, 4, and 5 years from now? And what do we have to plan?
And I think the guidance that we're going to probably need is to say, okay, do we assume average wage increases or employment cost increases of 3% or 4%? Or do we do them at that level and then say, okay, here is the sensitivity that if they move to 6% and stay there for any significant period, here's what it's going to cost you.
That's exactly what I'm looking for.
Now, the issue to all of that is it's good in a forecast for 5 years, but it's really only good every year when you review it again and say what's accurate about it. Because another thing that I read yesterday that I find interesting, the 2 or 2.5% inflation that the Fed would like us to have is going to go away because they're not going to be able to raise interest rates to get us back to those levels. They're probably going to pray for 3.5. We had 6 yesterday, you saw, or day before yesterday. I'm losing track of my days. 2 days ago it was 6%. So I think that's kind of the guidance I'm going to be wanting from you guys is where do we start? Have y'all made a decision yet on employment costs yet in this budget?
No, we're still waiting for our insurance numbers to come in. We do have knowns right now as far as Orbit, there's a slight increase. So we're waiting for everything to come in before we can come back to the board with a sound recommendation.
I got you.
We did talk yesterday about, when we looked at things and we had discussions with the MAP study that was done a couple years back. We foresee having to go through that process, I estimate 2 years from now, where we would delve into pay study and then also operations.
Okay.
So we're looking at 2 years. One of the things that I feel comfortable with sticking to that is that when the board did the MAP study and they approved it, the pay bands did not stay stagnant. So every time that the board each year approves a cost of living adjustment increase, that is included, the pay bands increase, so it hasn't stayed stagnant.
Okay, well, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
A lot of them do.
And then
Yeah.
and maybe I'm trying to uncomplicate this. Specifically, what I would like to see in something like this, we're talking about specifically allocating pennies to capital funds or to beach funds, and some of that is going to come out of the general fund. If we go and we start allocating X number of cents to those funds out of the general fund, and now we're short in the general fund, okay, because we've made a commitment to put these other funds, and we have to raise taxes because we put too much in those two funds. That's a concern of mine, is that we need to be conservative in terms of what we put into those funds, knowing that we can always increase it if we have a surplus, but we don't want to be short payroll money, okay, because we put an extra penny in one of the other funds and made that forecast. And that's my concern, is that those costs keep going up.
Okay, gotcha. So you would like to see some sensitivity inside the operating budget side? Okay, we can do that.
And what I would like to ask, Alice, do you feel that that's gonna be beneficial for you guys from an operating perspective as well?
I think that, I think that it's going to take a lot of staff time with Doug to put all of these into the numbers.
So-
It's not something that is gonna take a day or two.
And that's kind of
To
where,
map
I'm
out.
going. So when we reviewed the budget yesterday, and I know it was just our first meeting, and just being on the board for as long as I have, I've never had the concern that we were gonna rob the general fund, for lack of a better word, to fund another project somewhere else and then be short on payroll. I also think that this sensitivity analysis, in my opinion, is the same as an appraisal, where it's good for that day. So 6 months from now, I'm not saying it's not beneficial that the process is followed or done, but it's not going to help us make a decision in 6 months down the road. So that's kind of where I'm at, and I am not opposed to sensitivity analysis or whatever we need to do to help this board make informed decisions. I'm just wondering if it should be on the general fund versus where my real concerns are more on the capital side or on the beach side.
Right.
That's my personal opinion.
Well, let me point out something that Doug just talked about before. We're not talking about what he's working on right now being a 6-month project. He just told us at the beginning of this is gonna take years to where we need to be. Okay, and I think
That's not what I was saying. I didn't say his was a 6-month project. I'm saying that the data that comes out of this every year is gonna be as good for as long, like that day. Because inflation changes, interest rates change, the cost of borrowing, everything changes. So I think that we just need to be sensitive of the staff commitment that we're asking for and make sure that we target it in the area of the budget that would benefit this board the most. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm questioning whether it needs to be on the general fund.
Okay, and like I said, I mean, and just to be candid, I think one of the mistakes this town has made going back years is the failure to plan. Everything was year to year. Everything was 6 months to 6 months. We've got a fire station that should have been replaced 5 years ago, when the board at that point said, we can't afford it, meaning they didn't want to raise taxes to get a fire station, and now we're 6 or 7 years past it. All I'm saying is, in terms of what we look at as a board, everything doesn't have to be done today, and it doesn't even necessarily be part of this year's budget. But to ignore the fact, I think and again, my experience has been running businesses for 30 years, and the CEO, which is you, and this board's job is to keep the gorilla away from us, to not run out of money, and to start forecasting stuff. And I think to me, it's the wrong thing to say, I can't do a forecast because it's not gonna be accurate tomorrow. Because that means you do no planning, and I
That's
don't
not-
think.
but Rick,
Let me
that's
just
not what I
finish,
said.
Joanne. Can I finish, and then you can.
But your
you can say
concern
it.
is on capital projects, not day-to-day
No,
operational.
You're missing my point. My point is, he talked about having resolutions at the board level to be able to take funds and commit it to a project, whether it's the fire station, whatever. And he also talked about a lot of that money is going to come out of the general fund, because that's where the funding occurs that goes into those. Caitlin talked about taking pennies out of the general fund or out of the property tax and dedicating to property. I'm fine with that. What I'm saying, though, is if the difference in something like that, and we're looking down the road, is that instead of putting 5 cents in the capital fund, we put 4 cents in, all right? And that allows us to avoid a tax increase down the road to cover operating expenses in the general fund, then that's something we ought to consider. Because once we have a resolution, or we start committing funds to a project, those funds are gone for that 15 years that Doug described. That's my point.
But Rick, that sort of is contradictory to what you just said. If that was the case 5 or 6 years ago with the firehouse, and you would have been short, we would be short the capital money that we would need to build the firehouse. So I think what Doug is saying is we need to put the money in the capital fund first, so that we don't have to postpone needed capital improvements, and then, rather than, and worry about the operating on the back end.
Right, but we started off with this board saying, even last year, that we talked about where we were with property taxes and stuff. The idea was not to have to go back every year or 2 or 3 years to go back for money to start planning going forward. And all I'm saying is that I have no problem with putting money aside for capital projects, which I think we need to do. But once you've committed money out of the general fund to a project, it is gone for that period of time. It'll be encumbered by that project. That will not be available for payable.
And we have not historically, it's, from my opinion, at least, and Mike, you might remember differently, we have not historically encumbered the general fund, this board hasn't, for projects moving forward. What we have done are resolutions, because a good example is the police cars came in early, not a major beach project.
But wasn't phase 5, didn't that encumber general fund? Weren't we committed
I
to
said
maybe
this
five?
board.
No, I'm just talking about going back. I'm not talking
Yeah,
about
but
this board.
I'm just talking about this board, and again,
No,
I'm
we
not,
wouldn't do it at this board level. I agree
right,
with you.
so my point is, I'm not opposed to additional modeling or forecasting, but I just want to be sensitive of the staff's time, and I just want to make sure, at least for this initial pass, we focus on where we need to focus, because we've got additional, I mean, it's an ongoing effort. It's not gonna just be done tomorrow, to your point, but I think we need to focus, because I am a little bit sensitive of the workload that Caitlin has right now, and I do know that it's gonna take a significant amount of her time. So we don't need a decision right this second, but if the board could just keep that in mind as staff continues to try and finalize the budget, where should we be focusing our efforts to plan?
So I'm hearing two things here. I'm hearing that it would be nice if the sensitivity analysis could show us trends up or down in the future. But we also have your advice, and we have a good budget in place. But the other thing I'm hearing from the town manager is to do the sensitivity analysis to see how these things might change. We don't have the staff time right now because of the situation with the current staff we have in place to put the extra woman hours in process to do that. So that's kind of what I'm hearing.
Mike, that's what I'm
And
hearing too.
Yeah, and I'm still not sure, because this is the first time I've ever heard the concept of sensitivity analysis, but if I'm understanding it right, you're saying you've got this range of from high to low, and if you do the sensitivity analysis, it's going to show you how that range is going to change over time if A is such and such, and B is such and such, and C is such and such. Okay.
But Mike, I guess, maybe I'm getting lost in the weeds here. I'm not talking about you doing it by department. I'm talking about a high-level thing that says, today our payroll is $5 million, all right? And 5 years from now, if I use a 5% inflation, it's $7 million. That's all I'm looking for, okay? It's not gonna be, to the mayor's point, it's not gonna be in the weeds like that. And, you know, to me, you know, Doug, if you're creating something for us in a model, I'm lost as to how, you know, how that's gonna take that much time. I mean, I can have, you know, I know a CPA MBA that can put that schedule together for me in an hour. Okay, so all I'm saying is, I'm not asking for what you're talking about is digging in the weeds. I don't want that. That's way beyond what I'm asking for. I'm just looking for some idea of, you know, go back a couple of years, look at our expenses, forecast that forward. What does that look like in terms of revenue? That's all I'm looking for at this level. Is that?
Try and get an idea of how much this fire station is gonna cost us on a monthly basis first.
Exactly.
And see if we are able to cover that in what we have in the capital fund, so we know for sure that we're not touching the general fund. To me, that would be a quicker way to feel comfortable with what we've got in the general fund for this budget year.
We're fine with this budget year because the firehouse is not gonna be built this budget year.
If we're gonna be going out for the loan and the loan is in 90 days, then we're gonna start paying for something as soon as they start demoing on Firehouse.
Right, and we'll get
So that loan
but
will
Joanne,
be-
we'll get $500,000 from the county for the fire fund in July.
I
I think,
don't know if that covers demo.
Mayor and members of council and town manager, I've heard y'all say that the interest rate, the tax rate will remain the same,
Right.
Yes.
that we've got to get the fire station figured out, and we do. I think this is going to be a longer process, and I have to have more data. And I do worry about the Caitlin situation, because if Caitlin gets gone, my data's gone. You know, because I get my data from you. I'd like to be your accountant, but I've got too many other clients to do that. So my point is, shouldn't maybe we move the discussion of the operating budget insensitivity analysis, the allocation between capital and operating in terms
move
of
it to next
pennies and
year.
dollars. Maybe we move it into the fall.
That's fine.
After we've, because until I know what the capital budget, until we finish the, and Alice and I were talking about me coming back in May and presenting this to you. The more I've talked through this, that's just not gonna happen.
That's fine.
I think that we get this budget in place. Now, if y'all were in the middle of deciding whether or not a tax increase was gonna be necessary, then maybe you gotta do some envelope, or what do they call it on this, calculations. But I don't hear that, and I think the money's fine for now. So I see this more as you get through the budget process and we do a fall process or something like that.
I'm fine with that.
Now, Alice, are you okay with that?
Yes.
Fine with that.
You'll have a new finance person by then, hopefully, right?
Yes, and Caitlin will still be with us.
And Caitlin will
Or
be
she will
here,
have cloned herself.
and that will give her more resources to help us, because there'll be another finance person. So I really see this, I'm really getting the view of where y'all are going to, because I do think the proper allocation between capital and operating is an always decision. How much? How much is it now? And based upon our capital plans, what will it need to be 5 years from now? That's all very valid. But I just see this as a process that works its way into the fall.
And I'm good with that, because as I said, I think for this budget year, we have an idea, I believe as a board
good
are
this
all
year.
on the same page.
Yeah.
But moving forward, I am fine with the analysis. I think that would be a good thing to have, as long as it's refreshed on an ongoing basis.
Right.
And I think that that will give staff a chance to breathe, get through the budget.
Exactly.
And then be able to
Exactly.
focus on that.
I really like that. And then I think next year, when the forecast comes, it's more fully developed, because there's been more time, more resources available to it. I think what our challenge is going to be on the fire station is getting those bids in. Alice, we'll talk a little bit later, and you might want to talk to the people doing this now. I mean, I want to find out if we can do 120 days and it not cost us. And the reason I say that is, guys, because you don't have the $6 million just laying around. We have to have the loan done. Folks, to get this loan, we're gonna have to hire a bank, we're gonna have to develop documents, you're gonna have to have a public hearing, we're gonna have 2 board actions, so we're gonna be busy on the fire station between now and budget time. Well, June, cause, I was raised doing it on my fingers, so here goes, so we get the bid in, end of the month. Yeah, we need 3 to 4 months, and this is all going to be happening right in the middle of the budget process.
And again, I'm 100% with it. I agree with what the mayor said. My only point is, once you build the model, doing stuff with the model is a lot easier in terms of, to your point, if you got to refresh it every 6 months because something changed, that's fine. But if you don't have the model, then this is a
Yeah, I agree.
discussion we're going to
I
have every
agree
year.
with that. And it'll take some time to do this, so I'm really liking the process. I think we're getting all on the same page.
Perfect.
And I think that's a positive. And it will allow greater use of resources, not at the toughest time of the year, when we don't really have a full-time funded finance person. So
Tax
that's-
season's coming too.
That's, yeah, no kidding. I did that last Sunday. So, this is really the last slide, and I've really gotten where y'all are on where you want to be and when it can happen. And I just feel like this discussion was very worthwhile, because it got us to a better place on looking at timing and what it should have and those sorts of things. So I feel good about that. And also, when is the beach plan going to come in? When will we know more about that? Is that a bad question?
It's a fun 30 question. Mike, your microphone. Microphone.
It's a planning process, it's a strategic plan. We've got to develop what's called a 30-year engineered beach inlet management plan.
Yep.
And it's gonna take our new beach committee several months to get there.
Gotcha.
Well, and also, Doug, just to finish up on Mike's comment is, and what the mayor said before, we've got $20+ million worth of beach projects that are gonna happen in the next 2 years. Okay, you got 5 is still being finished, you got 4, we've got 1 We've got all this other stuff going on. So the idea, especially with the payments going on the USDA loan, the idea that we could have another large beach project, unless they're just giving us money and we can't avoid it, I don't see it. Do you guys? We gotta stick to our knitting now because we've got so much, we've got more projects going on right now we've ever had.
Sorry. Yeah. But I'm feeling really good about process here. I think you'll get a better product. As I'm hearing this, and y'all correct me if I'm wrong, I see the CIP is really big because we got the fire and we've got some other things that we got to figure out inside that. I see as an order of priority, subject to y'all's change, the beach fund is probably number 2, because I just see finding out the beach fund, and then our general fund and how we look at its contribution to capital and/or beach, and how much room that leaves for inflationary cost into the future is the one that falls out as number 3, because you kind of got to have 1 and 2 before you can get to 3. Okay.
I agree
perfect.
with that, yeah.
Perfect.
Just everybody on the board, is that a consensus? Yeah. Con, you good?
Thank you. CBG.
Does anybody on the board have any additional questions for Mr. Carter while we have him here in person? Mm-mm. Yay. Alice, you good?
I would just like to thank Doug for coming today and helping us through all this, and there's a lot of important discussions to be had. Just to say, offline, we'll be working together following this, once you make the bank inquiries, to see what the 15-year loans are looking at, and then I'll be bringing back information to the board from there on the next steps specifically for the fire station.
And I just want to thank you also, Mr. Carter. I mean, honestly, your input and assistance to this board has been, I don't know what we would do without you. So we appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And I get to see you at Unwassa, too.
I know you do, yeah. Uh-huh. Are you in all week for the, are you coming in person to the Onwassa meeting Thursday night? Yeah, okay.
That's later in the year.
Then if we're okay with, we can take a 5-minute break, yeah. I was gonna say, if we're okay with Mr. Carter, let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll just finish up our conversations from yesterday. We're gonna try and finish up. We had a couple items that were left over from yesterday that we wanted to finish the discussion on today. And the one was, I think we could start with the recreation budget line item first. So Connie, when we talked about that yesterday, and I really wanted some of your input on this, there's, I believe it's $7,000 in the budget right now for next year, and that's for an extension on the Christmas tree. What I would really like to see is some additional funds allocated to that for other recreation events. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a concert, but I know you wanted to potentially have movies in the park, you know, food trucks, like any of those things. Right now, we have nothing there. So I personally think we should have something in the budget for it.
So I do have a list of proposed little projects and stuff. Nothing that is as major as a concert, but just some items for both residents, visitors, local people. Just this year it's getting a little late for this, and I apologize. But things like a Easter egg hunt, maybe some vendor events, food truck rodeos, things that won't cost the town a lot of money, but would still need a little revenue to get off the ground. I've talked with the Onslow County Parks and Rec director for some good ideas, things that might even actually bring in a little money. But when I mean a little money, I mean a little money. But just to get off the ground, safety things with the police and fire department. So a little bit of funding would be very helpful.
So if we put potentially, say, 3,000 or 5,000 in for those types of events, do you think that would work? And then what we had talked about is, since we have additional budget meetings scheduled, is revisit the concert amount after April 1st.
Yes.
So we can see how we did on the concert, and then if there's any funds that we want to go in there.
Right, and this year with the concert, being that it's our first one, it's a learning experience. It's in the future, if we continue to have concerts, I can foresee them actually maybe making some revenue to put into the Parks and Rec fund. This year, we really aren't even looking to make
We're
any
trying to
money.
get through it.
If we can get through it, if we could break even, that would be awesome. Right now, it's just an event that we're basically doing to provide things for people to do, a nice event for the town to have. So, yeah.
Can I, and this is something we talked about yesterday, is philosophically, okay, I believe that we ought to have events at the town, as you talked about, to promote the town and stuff, and recognizing we've got economic limits, that the economics shouldn't be the determining factor in what we do, okay? I mean, you can make the argument, for example, oh, what payback do we get from a Christmas tree, okay? No, but my point though, Connie, is that, you know, from talking to you about this in the past, is things that promote the town and stuff like that, there may not be a hard said, I get a return that's gonna be this. And so, you know, I think that's your philosophy, is that we ought to be doing stuff. And then the question becomes, to the mayor's question, is how much money are we talking about? Is it material to the budget? And those type of things. So, I mean, from my perspective, I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Well, and I agree. I think it's not always all about the money. It gives a sense of community, a sense of identity to the town. We're just not a small beach town. We actually have more of an identity, more of a community. In the future, I foresee some of these events bringing in money to go into the fund to be able to fund self-fund and fund other projects, much like a high school, the football team door money brings in stuff for the girls volleyball, stuff like that. I think it's a really good thing. It's not always going to bring in money, and that isn't really the focus. But like you said, yeah.
Well, what I would envision would be some smaller ongoing stuff during the summer to keep some activity going on that people that are here every year could go to. and maybe having the two bigger projects, maybe like one in April and one in October on the shoulder season, to extend the period of time that people would come here.
I'm glad you said that, because I actually have a list that I had come up with in late October. I think I had sent it to Joanne. This was an idea of what I wanted to do, and actually have a workshop that I had wanted to do in January. Circumstances made it so that I was unable to do that. But I would like to still have a workshop that the townspeople, and not just the townspeople, but local people from the area could come in, maybe have some vision boards. This was an idea that the Parks and Rec director in Onslow had told me that it's a good idea to do. See what people are interested in. Have these little things every month, something. Whether it's like when Alice has we had the hurricane preparation, the safety meeting. The Turtle people have every Tuesday here at Town Hall, starting in June this year, they have a Turtle Talks. Just little things like that. I would like to have our own little festival sometime too, that we could build upon each year. Maybe like a sandcastle building festival or something like that. I'm not sure, but
So-
that's a lot of ideas. And instead of just sending it to the mayor, I'll send you guys all a copy too. Just to this year's a little slow, but we're gonna get up and going, and lots of ideas.
Well, and the one thing I was thinking about is right now we have, I think it's $2,500 that goes to the chamber every year. And from a North Topsail Beach perspective, while we support the chamber and their activities, we don't personally receive much support just because that's not the type of community we have. We don't have a lot of new businesses opening with ribbon cuttings and all of those things. So what I'd like to see is put some money into this, maybe Alice, maybe 3,000, like maybe 10 instead of 7 for the rec fund to start. But if we have to find some additional funds, maybe we scale down on what we're giving to the chamber and direct that towards Parks and Rec, as an idea. Does that sound good, Connie, to start?
Yeah, that sounds good, and I agree with what you said earlier. We're gonna see what happens with the Beach Music Festival.
Yep.
Learn our lessons,
And then
positive, and,
we'll regroup.
yep, and regroup
Yeah,
after
I'd be a
that.
little reluctant to cut from the chamber though, because they're working on some of the beach projects for us, like the Beach Clean project and.
Oh, we
and a
wouldn't
few-
cut-
A few of the others.
I'm not saying cut it all the way. I'm just saying, take a look at, and this would be from input from the staff as well, because I'm not, yeah, I'm not, because I know Alice did a lot for the Beach Clean project. So I'm not sure what we're getting out of it.
And what we gave last year is what they had requested. I don't even know if they'll request the same amount this year. Have they requested anything from us this year? So, yeah, I think they're happy sometimes with what you give them. I mean, everybody wants more, but
Do you want me to bring up at the county meetings? I know you've already talked to them, because they're having their budget stuff and everything else. Because I know they're looking at the 200 for us and some other things for us. I mean, they're pretty open to it, but they're very restricted in their budget. It's 84% of their budget's fixed by law. They don't have no control over.
right, one of the things that they have offered that is not financial is the use of any of their equipment that we might want to use. They have things like, we're not using it this time, but things like dance floors, Easter eggs, just tons of different items that if we ever decide to have a little sports thing, they've got sports equipment. We can borrow stuff from them that they want. She had just a large amount of input of different ways that they could help. That isn't financial, but actually would be saving us money from having to go out and purchase something.
The county's deadline for funding requests was March 1st.
Okay, then we're past that, that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, if everybody's good there, well, then we're gonna move on. The next item was the bike lane. And I was just filling Connie in a little bit from yesterday's meeting. What I would really like to see is that we do approve the DOT to move forward with the CAMA analysis about what we can do and the design. In my opinion, I don't know that they'll let us go down past like the Tiki Bar because of the 200, we're gonna be within that CAMA setback down there. But if there's a safe place to end the bike lane anywhere around New River Inlet Road that allows people the opportunity to turn around, like Seagull Lane, anything like that, I mean, I would be thrilled. But at this point, we as a board don't even know how far we'd be allowed to go.
Right, and I think we talked about at the meeting yesterday, Connie, was put it on the agenda for April 1st. We can't allocate money now on this thing, but we could have it as a board item on the 1st. I did look at what they sent us, and actually I was talking to Fred a little bit about it. If we fund the study, it's ours. You know, and those type of things would just be worked out in the legal stuff. But I think generally we're in favor of what they're doing, but I think it needs to be, if we're gonna try to approve or allocate money, it needs to be at a regular meeting.
In this budget cycle, and I know when Caitlin gets a chance to breathe, she was gonna see if there was any issues in approving that in this year's budget.
I watched the video from yesterday twice. Yes, I have no life. Anyways, yeah, me and Doug. I agree completely, and I read the email as well, and I agree with Joanne. We just talked about that briefly too. That when we do the study, knowing that it may not go all the way down to the end to the inlet, we should have some alternate stopping points in there. Seagull Lane, Gunny Boatman,
But
anywhere they can turn. I mean, I hate to, but even up to the Onslow County access that's up by Shipwatch, or, you know, we might want to have a few waypoints so that we have alternatives. But yeah, the sooner we can get that going.
but that still leaves us a question of, you know, we had talked about 3 years down the road. The 400,000 that we would need each year, are we deferring that and only gonna do the 100,000?
No, I think what we're saying is if we invest in the 100,000, we would like to invest in the bike lane going in. So if we need to set aside the 400,000 every year in the capital improvement category, if it doesn't get used for the bike lane because CAMA denies us, then those funds are still in the capital and could be used towards, you know, any of the other capital improvements that we need.
Okay, so then the next question is, does the response to the email we got from the state is, you want me to do that, or you want to do that, or Alice?
You gotta wait till April.
Well, I think
No, but I think we need to respond
need
to
to let
them
'em know.
before, let them know
gonna
that
be
we
on the
discussed it and that's gonna be on the
That's the
agenda.
answer.
That's the answer.
And I would respond to them just saying that this is the position we're taking and it'll be on our agenda, and the intention at this point in time is that the board wants to move forward with it, but if they could send the agreement back that we would need to sign
Start the process.
to start the process.
And that the formal vote would occur at the April
Yes.
meeting, and then we'd be able to,
Okay, so you want, I'll go
if
ahead
you're
and
okay with that,
Yeah,
Fred.
yeah,
That's fine. Okay, so the other item on here was if there's any other discussion of the budget. Was there anything else you had questions on, Connie, when you looked at it?
No, not at this time. There was a couple comments that I talked to the screen about, but I want to talk to Alice about it, so.
Okay, any other board member have any questions for staff?
We were still trying to decide what to do with the contingency fund. Are we waiting till April to have that discussion?
We were gonna plug
Yes.
in the salaries and
what I was
any
gonna say.
other additional
That was
items from
just
yesterday.
to give you the information and to just start the process to think on that, just
And I want the board to
to
understand
consider your
too,
alternatives.
when we, being me personally, and I know Alderman Grant too, was so concerned about the contingency fund a few years ago, we didn't have any other funds set aside for capital. So I think this board is doing a much better job putting things in the pockets of the budget where it's supposed to go. So I do personally still would like to have some type of contingency fund just in case there is a storm and we've got to get debris removal and those things moving. But we're just in so much of a better place right now than we were years ago.
Well, the other thing to point out too is I think that, and this is a month or so down in this process, is when you're looking at encumbered versus unencumbered cash, that's gonna drive, if we're sitting there and we know we've got X amount of cash available that effectively becomes a contingency fund, that's gonna affect what we think we need. If it's the other way, then we'll have to have a bigger contingency fund. And as the mayor pointed out accurately, is until we know the number for payroll and everything else, we don't even know what that looks like within the confines of especially under the different funds.
I did want to bring up cost of living payroll just briefly after watching yesterday's. I do think that we have to be sensitive and realize that Alice needs to make these decisions and then we just give the input. We shouldn't give the input first and do it backwards. This is Alice's ball game when it comes to the staff and the cost of living and everything, and then we'll give our input after she makes her recommendations.
Yep, I agree, and I was trying to make that clear yesterday, that Alice is already working with all the department heads. They've got their ideas on how they want to handle their things, and really, the board is supposed to focus on policy, but certainly want to make sure that we have a solid budget.
Well, and just to follow up with something that Mr. Carter said before, in his comments about what we need to do as a town, the fact that he's recognized how far we've come in the last 18 months in terms of budgeting and everything else, because, you know, a lot of states, well, a lot of states, a lot of towns don't have this. They don't do this, they don't do that. So I think that was very complimentary of what you've been able to accomplish in a very short time, so thanks.
Okay, then I am going to ask for a motion to adjourn.
Can I just?
Oh, yes, please, go ahead.
We've got the other set of, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to clarify, was there consensus on the recreation budget, changing it from 7,000 to 10,000?
I believe so, yes.
To be part of the budget process.
It's in the, yeah, and we still have to talk, see how the concert goes.
Right.
Yeah.
So we do have Caitlin on,
Oh,
on the line. Caitlin, can
Caitlin.
you hear us?
Hit the red button, Caitlin.
Good morning.
You guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can see you too.
Hello, hello. Sorry I can't be there with you guys.
That's all right.
So we wanted to do just a brief conversation about taxes. I think we mentioned
Oh, that's
it
right.
yesterday. Ricky, I think this is the slides we went through yesterday's. Did you get the second one I emailed you?
It's one that's starts with a bar chart.
Yeah, it starts with the bar chart, yeah.
It says Budget Workshop 1, Part 2, Rick. And it's got a tumbleweed on it. Not really.
Do you need me to resend it? All right,
That's it.
go to the next slide.
Next slide, but that's it, yes.
No,
Nope, it's
no,
not.
that's not it. I'll resend it now.
we're working on it, Caitlin.
That's fine.
Okay, I just sent it.
Yeah, it's just a summary we went over yesterday, except for the
She was working on some tax examples.
on the revenue neutral thing that's in there. There you go, that's it.
There we go.
Thank you, Ricky. So, you saw this slide yesterday, which talks about the property tax valuations. We got this earlier in March from the county, and it's just the current projection of the newest levy there on the far side, the dark blue, the 1.6 figure there. Like Alice said, we are under Onslow County's revaluation structure, and they have adopted to do a revaluation every 4 years, while it is state mandated to do it every 8 years. So you can see the rises there. The very first figure, you've got the 18-19 fiscal year, you can see the jump there. And then of course the one we had last year going up to the 1.5. Next slide, please, Ricky. And this, again, just wanted to have like a high level visual for you guys of some of how the numbers look with the changes. So I've graphed out the last 4 years and represented the reval figures as well. It has our initial revaluation levy, and then it also has the revised. If you remember, they came back with a revision and it ended up increasing for us as a revenue. You've got the figure of the amount of increase or decrease of said value and the percentage of that change. And included in that levy is always the motor vehicle taxes, so the tax that you pay annually on your car or your boat, anything like that. So when we take that out, and that is budgeted separately, so when we take that out, then you've got that final levy without the motor vehicle tax, and that is what we base our ad valorem revenues off of. So you can see there, then on the far right, where it has the revenues that we encumbered, or the revenues we received, projected, I guess, for those levy years, and the rates that we've had for each of those years. And the levy that we've received so far this year, again, as you know from yesterday, we plugged in that 43-cent rate like we had last year. And you'll go to the next slide, please.
Just a quick question, and Mayor, you may know this better than me. What's in terms of, I'm not going to use residents, in terms of property, I've used in my head 3,000 properties in North Topsail. Does that sound right?
I don't know that answer.
I was just trying to do the mental math and saying, I'm using $1.5 billion divided by 3,000. So if the average property, recognizing it's higher and low, and average doesn't mean anything, is about 500,000, and 1 cent equates to about $50 a year.
Well, I think 3,000 might be low if you factor in all of the individual condominiums.
Okay, so my
Yeah,
point
I
though
don't
is,
know.
I think, and Kayla, I think we talked about this before, that 1 cent for the average, not for the big houses or the small houses, but that 1 cent actually equates to $40 to $50. Does that sound right, Caitlin?
From our conversations last year, yes.
Okay, that's fine. I'm just trying to get perspective as to what we're talking about when she's talking about pennies on the taxes. Sorry, go ahead, Caitlin.
Right. No, you're fine, and I can reach out to the tax department and confirm
Not that
how
important.
many properties they have listed under that real property. That's also going to be encumbering your personal property. So it has several different figures built into that levy.
Yeah,
but I can get that.
it's not that important. I was trying to get a perspective, or a context around what we're talking about when you're talking about pennies.
And that brings in about 150,000. 1 penny brings in a little
For
over
us, yeah.
150. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll touch on that. You've seen this chart before in prior years, but it now is updated. So you've got the different examples of what the tax rate is on the left, or could be, and then the amount of revenue that would now bring in based on the new projected levy that we've gotten from Onslow County. Based on also what Alice and I were talking about yesterday, we've represented a 95% collections rate in this year's budget. Last year we plugged in a 90% collection rate. With it being a reval year, there was talk of a third and final levy figure coming in, and we weren't sure what that was going to be and if it was going to go up or down based on what we had. So we did 90% last year, but based on historical collection rates, and that goes back to our audit, we felt very comfortable going forward with a 95% for this year. So you've got your revenue amount listed at what that tax rate would bring in at then the 95% collection, and then what additional revenues that would bring in from this past year's revenue, that 90% collection. So you can see those first two rates, we would actually lose revenues, and then going forward, you can see the increase there. Without the 95% conversation, the amount of 1 penny is $161,250 at the 95% collections. Then 1 penny is equal to $153,187. So in the conversations, if you were to move pennies from one fund to another, if that is the desire of the board, then that's the dollar amount you're looking at decreasing from one fund and adding to another fund. Again, just an option. You can then see at the bottom, I have broken down the 3 different funds that we have: our general fund, capital improvements fund, and our shoreline protection fund, and the different penny amounts that are allocated there. We went through that yesterday. The 26 cents to the general fund, 7 cents to the capital improvement fund, and the 10 cents to the shoreline protection fund as it currently is slated, and then the different revenues that are represented for each of those. Are there any questions on any of this portion?
Nope. Looks good.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. The next couple slides are just the same slides you saw from yesterday, representing that amount of excess revenues you have as it currently stands. You're still waiting on salaries and a few other figures to be plugged in, but just so you have that number in front of you again. And then the next slide is, again, the same slide for the shoreline protection fund and representing those increase of revenues there, if the tax rate were to remain the same. And then the final slide is the shoreline protection fund, and then that difference is represented there as well. So very high level, but we just wanted to go over the taxes and kind of break it down for you like we did last year.
Caitlin, I did have one question. I apologize if you hit this yesterday, but if you could go back a slide where it shows the fire truck. Is that the fire truck that we're getting the loan from Joe MC on?
Yeah, so we created this line
That's the
item,
same one.
essentially like a savings account to start putting money away for
Certainly.
the fire truck. So this is our next one. I foresee this line item staying in the capital improvements fund. As we know, we will have future engines that we'll have to purchase, as well as the ladder truck I know is upcoming as well.
And then if we do receive the loan, will that just show as revenue coming in? Like, how does that show in the budget? Yes, okay,
Yeah,
thank
we
you.
see that as a revenue line item.
Thank you. Any other questions for Caitlin?
And we have, like we brought up yesterday too, about 368,000 in fund balance in that fund. That has been saved from the last 2 years. It's been put into that
In
fund.
the fire fund.
Yes, in the fire fund,
And then you'll have the, give or take 500,000 from the county going in.
correct.
Okay,
And you have whatever excess in revenues from this fiscal year too will be in play for next fiscal year. So in theory, we'd have over $1 million here for next year.
that's good news. Okay, any other questions? No? Okay, thank you, Caitlin.
Nice job.
You're welcome. Thanks, guys.
Okay, now I'm going to ask for a motion to adjourn, unless you have anything else.
No, just to make note on the workshop for May, now with Doug Carter not presenting in May, we won't need to set an earlier time, so we'll keep the hearing at 11 a.m.
Okay.
unless something comes up and the board wishes to have another workshop.
May
Okay.
10,
All
May
right,
10th,
and I will not be here on June 7th.
do we have a motion
you'll be on
to adjourn?
Teams.
Do we have a second?
Vote, yeah.
All in favor? Aye. Thank you, guys.
Good job, guys.